This week's episode of the ArtTactic Podcast is brought to you by ArtTactic.com. This year, ArtTactic is celebrating 25 years of trusted art market insight, backed by rigorous analysis and independent research. To learn more about all of our products, visit ArtTactic.com. Thanks for listening to the ArtTactic Podcast. I'm your host, Adam Green. While we see significant technological and other forms of innovation in many mainstream industries, the art world has often had a reputation for staying somewhat stagnant in terms of how it operates and how business occurs. That's why whenever there's an innovative new idea, we love to explore it further. In this week's episode of the podcast, we're joined by Will Jarvis, founder and CEO of Gertrude, a contemporary art platform and mobile app that directly connects emerging and independent artists with buyers. Will is also the co-founder of The Sunday Painter, a gallery based in London, and that gives him a particularly interesting perspective on both the traditional gallery system and the possibilities for new models in the art market. We hope you enjoy our conversation with Will. Thanks so much for listening. Will, thanks so much for joining us.
Hi, Adam. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. It's our pleasure. I'm excited to chat with you about a variety of topics related to the art world, but I want to begin with Gertrude, which is the platform and app that you founded that connects artists with buyers. For our listeners who may not be familiar, can you start by telling us what exactly Gertrude is and how does the platform work?
Sure. So Gertrude is a highly curated platform that pulls together some of the best emerging and independent artists and showcases them, their context and their work on an app and website. Those artists are generally, some of those artists are on their way to galleries. Some of them perhaps will never work with a gallery in terms of a representational relationship, but they're all very high quality artists who have, remarkable practices that we want to champion and promote.
Yeah, and we were chatting a few days ago, and you mentioned that you feel there is this kind of vacuum in the art world. There's opportunities for platforms like Gertrude where maybe some galleries are closing or struggling, maybe certain artists are being left without a clear home, or it's just in general a more difficult time for artists to get gallery representation. Can you talk to us about how you see this current structure in the art world, where these gaps are, and how you're trying to address them with Gertrude?
Sure. So I think it's really important that I state that I'm pro-gallery, that I think galleries do a really important job and good galleries really make the careers of artists. And I have, myself run a gallery for nearly 15 years with Harry Beer. And I really also empathize with the struggles that galleries go through, the pressures that they're in and under, the kind of culture that's kind of dictated to them by the kind of gate-kept system. And there's this kind of need to adhere to in order to kind of participate. So they're under a lot of pressure, but they're under growing pressure at the moment. And a lot of that is due, as far as I'm concerned, in a large part is due to the great wealth transfer, which is where a huge amount of money is moving from one generation to the next, and accompanying that is a shift in culture, a shift in ideals, a shift in values, and a shift in desires. And I think when we're thinking about this, the pageantry of the art world, which is kind of built around a very specific economic model that bills everything as it's an intentionally exclusionary economic model, that the way that prices grow is through exclusion. You almost need to drive up a secondary market to justify a higher price point within the primary, and that's fine for artists where that's relevant, but the whole system itself is functioning as if every artist has that level of demand. And the problem with that is that effectively you're leaving a lot of money on the table for prospective new buyers that can't join in with that system because there's a lack of transparency in terms of how it actually works. And that has to be maintained in order to drive up that sense of demand. And I guess I'm doing a bit of a rambling route round to talk a key point, which is like the difference between placing and selling. And I feel like the whole art world is framed around this notion of placing artwork, i.e. vetting every buyer. Prices are kept kind of like to the chest of the gallery, and things are done in a very certain way that are about like getting things in the right hand with the right people to make sure, no one undermines that market and to make sure the best doors are open that can be. That's fine. But as I say, it's only actually relevant for a tiny percentage of artists, and it might only be relevant for a set period of time. But the whole thing has to perform it. Whereas I think what I'm in the fortunate position of being able to do, because I'm working with artists that don't have gallery representation, but have an appetite to build a career, to drive things forward, and don't want to just sit on their hands hoping and wishing that one day a gallery takes notice and opens the world up to them. The position we're in is that we can just list things with the prices transparently. We've got a buy now, Apple Pay. It's very much an e-commerce platform in many ways. And the reason, a main component to why we're doing this is because as far as I'm concerned, there's a huge untapped demographic of potential buyers that just need the right kind of like care given to their interests. So I think that's where we're positioning ourselves. And I also think that's in line with this shift within this great wealth transfer, that this next generation is not into exclusionary things. They want things to be transparent. They want things to be clear. They don't like things to be overly pretentious. They're not trying to, join the pageantry and the dance and the dealer relationships. They want direct relationship to the artists. So that's where we're incredibly well positioned to kind of facilitate that growing, that untapped demographic.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And you've spoken in the past about the need for the art world to become more open and really to figure out how to engage with new collectors. And I think for those of us who are very immersed in the art world, we're either established collectors or you work in the art world, I think it can be honestly sometimes difficult to have that perspective, to take a step back and assess where the barriers are and why it is to a degree an insulated world and difficult for new people to join. What do you think are some of the biggest obstacles for new collectors, and what would it actually take for the art world to become a more accessible place?
It's a tricky one. I think we're all victims of being a bit institutionalized by our industry. It's a very hard industry to access in the first place, and you gain this kind of almost esoteric knowledge about how things are done, how things are signified. And there's a certain privilege to that. And we can get a bit high on that privilege because we're part of the accepted few. And that's remarkable. I'm not throwing that in anyone's face. There's real value in some of that. But there's also, we're leaving money on the table when we're a shrinking industry that's really up against it. When I think about NFTs and I think about, there's been so many sways of weird economic bubbles that are like peripheral to our world that in some way we should have grabbed hold of and coax these people into our kind of world view, like how we see things, what we think value is beyond an economic value, like what's the value of culture. But I'd say generally I like talking about class, but I'm also aware that that's quite specific to a UK audience. That experience is quite tied to us, I think. But there is still, I think that the key component, originally I thought we felt the biggest barrier to entry was economic. But actually the biggest barrier is that people don't feel entitled to an opinion about art. So it's educational. And I think a lot of the mythologies that have helped aggregate this kind of perceived value of art, that like put it on this pedestal, have a dual function in that they inadvertently also turn a bunch of people off because they can be perceived as incredibly pretentious and they're incredibly intimidating as well. So people aren't going to buy something unless they really understand it. And unlike the rest of kind of conventional consumerism, there isn't like, this is subjective. This is totally subjective. So you're not going to sell, you can say this is the best, and maybe some people will believe there is a best. But as far as I'm concerned, we don't have a binary metric in this industry. And ultimately, especially with emerging artists and independent artists, what we need to cultivate is an ability for our buyers to know themselves well enough and be confident enough to trust their own taste and to take those strides forward. So this is a long roundabout way of me getting to the point here. We work a lot around creating content that just hopefully delivers a level of understanding that people find refreshing, accessible, but also doesn't actually water down the quality of the art, which is a key component. Getting the tonality right between like holding and conveying the cultural value of something, but also doing it in a way where someone feels like, oh, I can get on board with that, whereas they previously felt just intimidated.
Also, there's one aspect of Gertrude that I don't think we've touched on yet, which is that you simply don't just accept any artist who applies for the platform. You're incredibly selective, and you're coming from a really interesting perspective, having co-founded The Sunday Painter, a great gallery in London, and you're very immersed in the art world and engaged in interacting with many artists and collectors. So I'm really curious the criteria that you think about when you're reviewing artist portfolios and considering them for the platforms. I mean, on our podcast, many of our listeners are collectors and like to collect artists early in their career. And also many of our listeners are actually artists who maybe are in school or are without gallery representation. And so I think kind of sharing your checkbox in your mind or some of the things you think about when determining which artists you want to have join the platform could be really insightful for our audience.
Absolutely. So I think, first of all, I mean, it's good to reiterate it's a heavily curated platform that 9 out of 10 artists are not added to Gertrude. So 1 in 10 comes on board. Artists can apply to join, and we also reach out to artists. This is really, really important because when we're cultivating this new demographic of buyer, we've got to make sure that any choice they make within the platform it stands up, that it's quality, credible art, and that every artist is authentic, vetted by us. Having said that, what we're looking for artists, you say more emerging artists, but actually, honestly, what we're finding is the most artists we're working with are kind of often in their 40s and upwards, a lot of female artists. But I'm finding, and I think this is an important point to get to, there's a marked difference between how the industry works with artists and how I think we're trying to cultivate set behaviors with the artists on Gertrude. Often, when you have a gallery, the gallery does everything. It does a lot of things on the behalf of the artist. And often artists won't even find out who their buyers are. They won't have access to their market. They won't do their own, they won't arrange shipping or photography. Maybe they'll have a hand in it. Most of it is done by the gallery. And that's great if that works for you. But I always advocate that, like, the danger of that is that it's a form of golden handcuffs. And if you then have a gallery go down on you, you have no access to information about these things. So for us, what's really important is that rather than being in front of the artist, we're behind the artist, encouraging them. It's give a man a fish, teach a man to fish. So it's like teaching them the skill sets that are going to really aid their own personal growth and putting them in a position to have agency. That's a really key thing, and not have to just wait around hoping, but to give them, like, within the onboarding process itself, making sure that there's a kind of array of information they can share with their prospective buyers, but also walking them through, a sales funnel. Like, how does an artist, they might have built up 2,000 followers on Instagram. How do they convert some of those people into buyers? And it's walking them through, having a Gertrude profile and then signposting really clearly behind my work on my profile at Gertrude. This is how you do it. Or the fact that we've built a system that triggers sales leads and that allows us to kind of, capture interest and monitor interest and say the right things at the right time to convert those people into buyers. But I think when we're looking at the artist, what we're looking for is, that sense of like autonomy, that willingness to be autonomous, that appetite to move things forward, the willingness to kind of collaborate with us. high quality images, the fact that they're engaged with building a following anyway. Maybe they've got an Excel spreadsheet of or a mailing list, and they're building their Instagram following. Like, we want the proactive artists. We don't want the super passive artists expecting it all to happen for them, because it doesn't work like that in the real world anyway. And when I've been working as a gallerist, the artists that have done the best or even come into our roster have often been the ones that have already been cultivating their own collectors, their own following, and already know the game. So that's really what we're looking for, like a authentic practice, but one that is in the hands of a professional or an aspiring professional.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. It's one I've talked about with artists privately from time to time. We've discussed it a little bit on the podcast, but not very much. And I don't think it's something emphasized very strongly in art schools. But tell me if I'm interpreting what you're saying correctly, is that you feel that the sort of romantic vision of an artist alone, isolated in their studio, only focused on their art, that is a dated philosophy. And really, especially given all the tools we have with social media and technology, artists at this point, they need to have an entrepreneurial mindset. They can't only focus on their art practice, unfortunately, or fortunately, but they really have to take control of many aspects of their career, and they have to do things to create opportunities for themselves rather than simply just sitting back and hoping their work gets noticed.
I'd go a step further, and I'd say that that's a mythology, and it doesn't cover the whole truth. The artist struggling away in their garret until finally they're discovered is a beautiful story, right? We're in an industry of storytelling. That's a wonderful story. But the truth or the part that's missed out is that, oh, and their brother-in-law was like an art dealer for this gallery, or there's like some component that doesn't furnish the story in a way that we as the viewer or the spectacle demands. So I'd go a step further and say, like we're kidding ourselves a little bit if we think that purest story is actually is entirely the truth. I mean, yeah. So today it is about. It's not. I think there's no difference. I think, like, if you look back, artists throughout history, some of the most successful, actually, are the most kind of like entrepreneurial or kind of aggressive in driving their career forward. Yeah, there was the odd exception, but I think it's a key component.
And so even beyond Gertrude, of course, as I mentioned, you're one of the co-founders of the Sunday Painter in London. And I'm really curious how you're thinking about the art market right now, especially the challenges facing younger galleries, maybe smaller galleries, rising artists. I'm curious what you're seeing from your vantage point.
Sure. I mean, I think it's pretty cooked right now. I mean, it's struggling. Let's be honest. Let's get real. The way that I'm seeing it, and the way that I've been kind of thinking about it the most, is when I look at it's a pyramid, and when I look at it, I think about, at the top we've got blue chip galleries, which now feel like they're monopolies. They're like really solid monopolies, and they probably have a good leg at least within kind of parallel luxury markets, and they're anchoring themselves economically in a way that has greater stability than purely selling art. So maybe there's a property element, or some other component. Then I'd say in the middle, it's getting absolutely blown out, like blown apart. That I feel like the midsection's really, really suffering. So there's big gaps where in the middle, where it felt like that was quite a system of continuity previously existed. And at the bottom, it's atomization. It's the individuals becoming the drivers for their own career. And like, I'm not saying this is a good or a bad thing, but I feel like I'm servicing a reality, and I'm a pragmatist. And I think that's what Gertrude's built on. I think in the absence of a gallery, artists need to be their own gallery. They need to carry the same values. They need to carry the same route, and they need to advocate for themselves in a way that a gallery does. But I'd say, like, here's the thing. It's when you're a gallery, or when you're a younger gallery, for example, I mentioned earlier, it's a gate kept industry. It's a gate kept system, and it's self-policed. It's internally policed. And that means it's incredibly hard for them to do things that will initiate a greater breadth of buyer, because they can't do what I'm doing. Because if they start putting prices on the wall, yes, they might get one or two new buyers that drop off £500, but they'll alienate the whole rest of the system and the buyers that want to pay a lot more money, because not showing stuff is part of that esoteric mode of communicating that you know what's up. So they're not really in a position to make significant change. But my real genuine hope is that with Gertrude, we can cultivate these artists early on, build a following that's outside of the conventional art market, and then help place those artists with galleries and have the following kind of go with them. And we've had two instances where we've had great success with that. One with Bex Massey and one with Jill Tate, both of which are now with 17 Gallery after a collaborative exhibitions that we hosted with them. So that's a kind of component that we're also encouraging and are advocates for. But I do think it needs, the way I look at Gertrude in relation to that pyramid is we're a new layer docking to the bottom that's more porous, that effectively pulls in art talent and also new buyers, prospective new buyers, and pulls them into our system. And then we effectively coach both parties in how to communicate, participate, frame, understand this esoteric kind of knowledge that we have internally about art and the art system and value and how all of that works.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting and timely, honestly, given the current market conditions. Will, thanks so much again for coming on the podcast and sharing your really valuable perspective on everything happening in the art world, as well as introducing us to your new app, Gertrude. If our listeners want to download the app and check it out further, what's the best way for them to do that?
Sure, you can just download it at the Apple Store, basically. Just search Gertrude and we'll come up. Or you can also download it for Android, and you can check out the website. And you can follow us on Instagram, Gertrude__art, or me at Will Jarvis.
Perfect. Thanks again, Will. We appreciate it.
Thanks, Adam. Thanks very much.